Good morning, everyone. This is Steve Adler from IBM, and this is the third in our series of System Dynamics XMILE webinars on industry solutions. As you may recall, if you joined us for the first two, in the beginning we looked at the impact of CO2 emissions on climate change with Climate Interactive and their C-Road simulation. Then we looked at Rethink Health and the impact of community health on better outcomes. And today, in the third of our series, we're going to look at financial services and a credit card market simulation. You know, every day, all of us in companies face challenges in the market that we don't fully understand. Sometimes we look at declining revenue or competition or changes in market structure, and we try to adjust by focusing on past patterns and things we're comfortable with to try to change the situation and improve our competitiveness and our revenue. And often we just don't know why things are changing the way they are or why the things that used to be good enough just aren't anymore. And for many businesses, this can lead to a downward spiral without any results and a blame game and internal competition and real challenges. We want to share with you this morning a story that many of you, I think, will be able to relate to, of a company that's could be one of ours that has had historic market dominance, and then all of a sudden woke up one day and realized that they were no longer in a leadership position, that they faced new challenges from new competitors and declining market share and declining revenue, and tried to throw everything they knew how to use at the problem and couldn't find a solution until they turned to an innovative company named PA Consulting, who had an idea that by taking a systemic view on the issues, they could find the source of their problems and resolve them and develop a new market strategy. And that's the story we're going to look at today as we hear from David Starr and Sharon, who will share with us a terrific example of how system dynamics can change the way a company sees itself, the way it sees the market, the way it sees its competitors, the way it sees its products, and really have a profound impact on revenue and market share. So we're going to hear from them first, and then we're going to have a discussion about XMILE, the system dynamics standard that we're developing at Oasis, and its impact on simulations and models like this in the future, and what you can use it for to create new types of reusable, componentized solutions to understand your markets and your challenges and reuse your models and simulations over and over again. We'll have some Q&A at the end. We'll take some questions from each of you, and we'll have an interactive discussion both on the phone today and offline after the call. Now I'd like to introduce our first speakers today. That's David Starr from Cooper Human Systems and Sharon from PA Consulting Group, who will talk to us about a credit card market simulation. David, Sharon?
Thank you for the introduction, Steve, and thanks to those of you who have chosen to join us today. I've had the privilege and fun of spending over 20 years using system dynamics simulation to help clients. This work has been in a variety of industries, including, for example, financial services, an example here, gaming, telecommunications, technology, shipbuilding, aerospace, the list goes on, and we've helped these clients in a range of ways. Today, David Starr and I will tell you about work we did in the credit card industry a number of years ago. At that time, David was one of our original clients in that organization. He was in charge of a large project to use technology to reinvent the company, and he brought us in. I was part of the PA team, along with Ken Cooper, Jim Linus, and Bill Dalton. Dave, why don't you give them a little background on what was going on at this organization during that time?
Sure. The credit card company that I was with had previously been the dominant credit card company in the industry, and with one large competitor. And over the last 6 years or so, that market situation has inverted, and the the competitor was now the dominant one, and we were going down quickly. And that happened over a period of about 6 years. And everyone was blaming everyone else. Finance blamed marketing, marketing blamed the franchise people, everybody blamed IT. So they decided to put together a project to see if they could redo the IT infrastructure. And one of the projects that we looked at was trying to use technology like system dynamics. There was a lot of confusion about what to do, and this was one of the ways we were trying to figure out how to do it. A lot of the things you were running into and the way things we weren't able to get past were, we've been doing this for 20 years, and why shouldn't it work now? It's worked in the past. And really the finance people probably coined the best term of it all. They called it a death spiral. Their own internal their own internal model said that this particular company was going to be out of business in 5 years. So it was pretty desperate. Nobody knew what to do, and we needed some way to try and put all this stuff into perspective and figure out an approach.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the dynamics that were going on at the time and what was driving market share at the time. This will give you an appreciation of some of the early things we sketched out in our client meetings. The first one is an example of a dynamic going on between MasterCard and Visa. Both of these companies are bank card associations. They don't issue their own cards. Various member banks issue the cards, and the association, MasterCard or Visa, supports the brand and performs operational functions for its members, including transaction processing, authorizations, interchange settlements, and fee processing. The dynamic going on here is that as one association has a greater market share, bank issuers tend to focus their advertising on that company, further increasing the association's market share. This is an example of the success to the successful dynamic, or archetype. Of course, if you want to learn more about some of these common archetypes, you can look at some of Peter Senge's work or take a look at the ISee website. The story of the successful archetype applies to all sorts of situations, leading to well-known patterns of behavior. The rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, winners being rewarded with the means to win again, popular brands attracting more popularity, one species driving a competing one to extinction. Another dynamic going on at the time, another success to the successful dynamic, was consumers use the card they have most recently used because it's at the top of their wallet or because they only want to make one monthly payment, thereby reinforcing the use of the most recently used card. So as you use one card more, perhaps driven by advertising or promotion, you tend to use it more and more. Let's look at another dynamic going on. The next one is actually called the limits to success archetypes. And when we work with clients, we don't always show the archetypes, but it is a useful way to go back and explain some of the behavior that's going on. So this one is, while a firm's advertising and promotions will increase purchases on a particular card, as a cardholder starts to reach their credit limits, they will switch to another card in their wallet or apply for additional cards.
And this was a great example of a non-intuitive result that came from the model that no one had really thought of before. And afterwards, everybody said, oh my gosh, of course that's right. And what the model said is if you want people to use their credit cards more, get them to increase their monthly payments. Now, everybody looked at themselves and said, why on earth is that the case? Well, what it turned out to be is most people had their credit cards topped out. So if you made them pay $50 a month, they used the card for $50 the next month. If you made them pay $100, on the other hand, they'd use it for $100. So this really simple idea that no one had ever thought of had a huge difference in the ability of us to get people to use their cards more.
Great. So insights like this and interviews help sketch out some of the early dynamics. But the overall simulation model was derived from both expert interviews and a variety of data. So on the top left there's the real-world experience of executives and employees. There's other situations from other industries that could be applied. Top right, there was considerable historical quantitative data that we used and even collected more than anybody had had before. There's also qualitative assessments from industry reports and surveys. And then when we went on to do some of the international work, because we adapted this to a number of international markets, we went on to look at a number of different studies and talk to employees in those countries.
And of course, the credit card business is an international business. And this is a good example of how the success of the systems dynamics project is not always dependent on technical things. In fact, when we brought this idea to Europe, it was immediately pushed back because they didn't want to have Americans shove some idea down their throats. So after a long period of time, we ended up telling them that this was their idea and renamed the project to Columbus and told them they were bringing it to America, at which point they thought it was a great idea, and we went on to have great international cooperation.
I forgot that story, Dave. That was an interesting one. So the first simulation model that we built was largely focused on our client, not the overall industry and not international market dynamics. But of course, to understand the competitive issues, it had to be expanded. Dave, you often tell a story about how, wow, this diagram helps people understand how complex the business really is.
And most people don't realize how complex their business is. And I remember one of the vice presidents that I was working with actually put this up on her wall and would bring people in and show it that this is not just A plus B equals C, that there are all these interacting things. And I've found that that's the case in most places where I've seen this, that one of the biggest benefits of using this kind of approach is showing people that it isn't a very trivial solution, and there are a lot of moving pieces.
Right. And I know some of those executives, and they would say, wow, look at this. This diagram is so complex, and this is why my job is so hard.
Exactly, yeah.
And I've never been certain whether it's a career-limiting move or not. But okay, so next we expanded the model to include all U.S. competitors and all the ways in which they compete. So the terms offered to customers, merchant acceptance locations, available credit, service quality, etc. Then we went on to calibrate the model to a variety of historical data. I pulled up an old spreadsheet buried on my computer, and evidently Microsoft is still supporting old versions of Excel, not like everything else. And here's a sample of the historical data we collected, and this isn't even the full list. It seems like a lot of work, right, to collect all this historical data year over year. So why do people bother to calibrate? Well, it helps understand whether or not the data is consistent, and it also builds confidence in the team who's making the decisions around whether or not they would be confident in making the right decisions. So they want numerical accuracy. They want to get a sense of the cost-benefit trade-offs. The calibration also often uncovers errors in some of the other models or data that we have. And it reveals inconsistencies in mental models. So people have ideas of what's going on in the business, but if they look back a few years and the model isn't matching data, this helps them understand what some of the prior or potentially future dynamics were operating at the time. So the initial business-as-usual simulation showed that without major intervention, our clients' share would continue to fall, and that they would realize many of the fears that they had. And this is, of course, not the type of news that you want to give to a client. Their planning department was in the middle of looking at hundreds of different initiatives. And I think I remember back then you handed us, various binders full of, these are all the things we're planning to do. And the overriding question was, well, where are we going to get our biggest bang for our buck? So we worked with a number of teams, going from department to department to evaluate what sort of impact these different initiatives would have. And nothing seemed to make an appreciable difference. I mean, it took us weeks. We went around. Nothing was really turning things around. As a consultant, you don't like to go back to your client empty-handed and say, well, maybe there's something else that can help you, but we don't know what it is. So what we started to do was we started to sensitivity test hundreds of factors in the model to assess where the leverage was. And this work predates the newer software, so this was a few long but memorable nights sensitivity testing individual parameters in the model. What we found was that there were many things that did little or nothing to market share, but then there were some other higher leverage factors. We showed this to David and some of the other stakeholders, and then we sat down and jointly figured out, what were some of the initiatives or combinations of initiatives that could work for the organization.
Yeah, there's two interesting things about this chart. If you look at the four things at the top of the chart, this really was our business plan. These were the areas that we had all of our finances and budgets decked against, and the model told us these things weren't going to do much at all, and some of them were going to make it worse. The second thing we learned is there really wasn't one thing that was going to make a difference. And like a lot of system dynamics solution, it was a combination. And that's the combination of the four things at the bottom, which ultimately produced the affinity card, which Sharon will tell you a little more about.
Right. So our client was Dave's company was first to market with affinity cards, which later came to be known as co-branding. And their market share over that period of over the next few years increased significantly. And we ran into one of
well, years later, I was the CIO at 3Com in California, and the lady who was the head of marketing for 3Com had been at our competing credit card company. And we were having lunch one day, and she just looked at me and said, you know, David, how on earth did you guys ever figure out how to do the affinity card? We knew that none of your marketing guys were that smart. So I told her, well, we had some help there, and told her about system dynamics, and we ended up using it at that company as well, partially as a result of that lunch conversation.
And yeah, she used it to reallocate her promotional dollars, advertising spend, you know, across different products in different markets. So a real neat project. You know, in summary, co-branded cards have transformed the U.S. card industry. There's a list of some co-branded cards there, and system dynamics turned out to be really useful in understanding the causes of the problem and looking at what were the options for improving it. And I won't go through these one by one, but there's you can take a look at those.
Okay, so I'm Karim Chichakly, and we're going to talk about XMILE for just a few minutes here. This is a standard developed with OASIS right now to allow us to interchange system dynamics models. And at the current time, you'll see, if you've been in our other webinars, you've seen a similar picture, where we have different vendors and software that don't communicate, but with XMILE, they can share models between themselves, and so people can more readily share models. What does this really mean for us, though? This is the XML encoding, by the way, in the middle of these two models. What does this really mean, though? The benefits, I mean, a lot of people ask, why is there a standard, and why do we care about XMILE? The first benefit is that it legitimizes the market. When you have proprietary formats, then it's throughout a field, and it's really hard for people to adapt your products and use your products, and your field becomes very closed. Having an open standard changes all that, and it also reduces risk to large corporate customers who may wish to implement system dynamics models in their systems, which leads directly to the ability to embed those models into business processes. So if that happens more, then system dynamics has a greater impact as it gets used in different corporations. It also promotes innovation by opening up the ability for third parties and smaller players to develop their own products and their own add-ons to the offerings by the vendors. It increases collaboration between different people, because if I'm using one product and using a different product, then we can now share things between us. In total, what it does, it expands the total market for system dynamics models. The standard is very good for the field. One of the things that we can also do with these, with the standard, is we can pull out components of models that are being used. So we can pull out components from the model that Sharon and Dave just showed us, and they can be reused again. So this is a component of that model that looks at credit card growth, and this can be represented in XMILE and reused by anybody across any system that supports XMILE. There's another model here, credit card payments taken out of this model, so you can look at this as well. And you can see that in order to share these, you need to know things that are going on. So in bold, we have inputs that have to come into this model for it to work, and the double line stock here is an output. But we also need to know other information about how this is used for different purposes, how this could be used, what its correct context would be, and all of that needs to be encoded in the XMILE to facilitate reuse. You can then take these different models and you can reuse them in other cases. So for example, if I were a department store, I have a private label card, I might reuse the card growth model right here on the side within my larger model for my business, for my department store business. Within OASIS, we have the XMILE Technical Committee, and the Technical Committee is the one who is bringing this standard to fruition. We're hoping to have an early draft for people to look at in mid-December, and we're hoping to have a much later draft that is closer to a vote sometime in the late spring. We would love to have extra people help us out with this. If you want to join us, that is the link below. We are now ready to take questions, and I think, Sharon, you have the first question?
Sure, I can, I see a list of questions here. I can read them. Do you want to take, well, okay, so the first question is, the model you showed is complex. How do you expect people to understand it? If it's not understood, it will not be used.
Well, that's exactly right. If it's not understood, it won't be used. And the way when I've been involved in the ways we've always gotten people involved is have them come up with the cause and effect relationships themselves. So it's a pretty complex and lengthy interview process, and a lot of things that were common knowledge turned out to not work, and we would be able to go back and test them and say, look, when we actually put these things in, that isn't the case. A lot of people find out things they never knew as a result of that process. But the key to the whole thing is them feeling ownership of it and feeling that they put this together and not just someone handed them a giant spaghetti chart.
Okay, great. The next question says, how long did it take to complete the investigation, and how many folks were involved in the project? So the initial work was a 3-month effort with a small team of people, and then I think we went on for at least probably about a year and a half, you know, with a slightly changing team over time. But, you know, at any point in time, we were talking about 3 to 5 people, you know, more when we were collecting data, and we went on for a few years as it expanded to the international work.
The initial results were after about a year, and then we went into various refinements of it for the rest of that time.
The next question here is, the sensitivity analysis seems to be a traditional statistical approach. How is it related to or driven by SD?
Well,
So,
I mean, it was a typical statistical approach, but it was a typical statistical approach to inputs and outputs of the SD model.
Exactly. So, yeah, we varied parameters, and those were fed into the SD model, and then the dynamics and the time delays and the nonlinearity basically played out via the simulation model over the next years. Okay, the next question says, could you describe more operationally how the co-branded cards created the improvement seen in the model? What loops did they engage, or what archetypes did they leverage?
Well, I can answer that from the operational side, because what was going on is the banks were the owners of the credit card business at that point, and no one had ever gone outside the banks. And we found from the model that if we continued to let that happen, the banks wouldn't compete against themselves, and our share of the market would just continue to go down and down. So the model said, look, you've got to go outside the banks. And this, of course, was blasphemy to all the marketing people who said, basically, if you do that, the banks are all going to leave. Well, we ran some runs in the model, and the model said, surprisingly, the banks will not walk away from money. So that wasn't going to happen. As it turned out, it didn't happen. And the other thing that made that such a powerful approach is we signed exclusive agreements with the affinity partners for about 5 years. And so for 5 years, we were the only company that could go out and do these things with the prime partners. And that's really how we gained our market share back.
Yep. Good, and we actually have a whole set of slides that we presented to you guys back then,
Exactly.
walking through all the dynamics, but we didn't bring all those today. So the next question, given the potential of the success to the successful structure, why didn't the projection of business as usual show an exponential decline for the client? What elements of the system counteracted its impact? Looks like the positive feedback loops powering Visa and weakening MasterCard were negated, not just mitigated. So the decline, the chart of that business as usual decline in the chart we actually showed you does not show that dynamic of the Visa and MasterCard downward spiral. So when we do add that in, the picture looks even more bleak. So that's a very insightful question, that he knows that that dynamic was not shown in that chart. So.
The next question is, in the credit card company model, when you make policy changes for the client company, will the model capture response from the competitors, such as after your client increases service charges and the credit limit, will your competitors start using the same strategy? If so, will the impact of such policy get weaker? Yes, in fact, the model wasn't just of one credit card company, it was of 5. The major one and then the 3 smaller players. And we could anticipate not only what they would do, but also some things we could do to make their responses less effective.
So there's a question here about talking about XMILE in the context of the current session, and that is my fault for not asking Sharon how XMILE might have helped with this project or might help with future projects like that.
Yep, and had we had XMILE at the time, we probably could have easily reused a number of structures from other models and incorporated those. I think XMILE is also really relevant to some of the other work we do in program management, because we are always reusing the same structures again and again, and if they were in more of a standard format, it would be that much easier.
Great, thanks, Sharon. So you had an impressive list of data regarding competitors. Was this mostly time series or point values? How did you get this data?
Yeah, mostly from the banks, because the banks, again, had information on both us and our competitors, so it was pretty easy for us to get a lot of data on what we were doing and what they were doing.
And there was a lot of industry studies, and we were looking at 7 years of historical data, and that's the common approach that we take when we build simulation models. We tend to, and many people in this industry tend to go back and collect considerable historical data and calibrate to that data.
Through how many phases did the model evolve to reach the one shown?
I think we went through about 3 main
There
phases.
were 3 main iterations, yeah.
Yeah, there was the first prototype model.
That varies based on the model. This just happened to be 3. I don't think there's anything magic about 3.
We're going on one of our clients like phase 8, but and you can apply this to so many different things. Looking at how customers are moving to mobile devices, looking at changing demographics and how that will play out over time, and what that will mean for different investments. So there's the number of phases can be unlimited.
Great. And how do you verify that each part is really working right and actually reflects what's going on in real life?
That's exactly why we calibrate these models. So it's the process. I think we've switched the presentation, but it's that process of pulling information from individuals, pulling quantitative studies, pulling qualitative studies, and going back and recreating what happened historically over time. And is it ever perfect? No, it's never perfect, but it's better than trying to simulate it in your head.
Great. So that leads to the next question, which says, which method did you use for parameter calibration? Could you explain the process a bit more explicitly?
In this case, what we do is we iteratively calibrate the model, parameter by parameter, manually. In this, example, and we cross-check that, based on people's impressions of, what should this relationship be between, discount rates and card usage and merchant acceptance and, user use of cards.
So you're saying some of those variables are soft in the sense that...
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So can you just talk about how you
Oh,
you want to talk a little bit about how you hone in on those soft variables? And
we do that basically through lots of interviews. So it's a regular process of understanding what drove purchasing behavior over time, and looking at different types of cardholders. There are some people who use credit cards in different ways, and understanding, basically factor by factor via interviews and data if we have it, elasticities and time delays to hone in on those factors.
Great. Please elaborate on the systems thinking that was used to arrive at the co-branded strategies. In what ways were simulation runs essential to the initial strategic thinking, and
Yeah, the model didn't actually identify this. What it did is it took some old ideas that we had and been pushed aside, and we tested them. So someone had thought of doing co-branding a long time ago and said, no, that's just not going to work because it'll scare all the banks away. And that's where we were able to show that that wasn't the case.
Are there any gaming multiplayer capabilities incorporated? No, not in this simulation model. So it's it's a few years old, and in this it could of course be adapted for that, but no, there's no gaming type of interface wrapped around it at this point.
Did the actual growth that from the turnaround, did it correspond very well with the predicted growth from the model?
It did.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say so yes, it definitely did. So we were very much on track in terms of market share, and it actually was even slightly more successful than we thought as cardholders used their cards more and more. Because these co-branded cards offered value-added services or cashback or other things, it was even more profitable to the banks than we anticipated it was going to be.
There's an interesting question. It says, I heard a story that the essential structure of the Litton Industries project model was actually sketched on a napkin over lunch with a client. Did the modeling team have early initial insights into the key component structures of the system? There seems to be so few really impactful examples of SD models. Is this because successful modeling requires talent, not just mastery of skills? I have sat on airplanes and watched Ken Cooper draw system dynamics CLDs of major diseases and in periods of less than an hour. And all of my experience is that this is something that's as much of an art as it is a science, and that the years of modeling experience make a big difference, because some of the good modelers almost intuitively know where in the model the stress points are going to be. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
So another question, how many users were exposed to it? I would say most of the executive team was exposed to it. We had some internal people focused on working on the simulation model. So, it's at least dozens, maybe more.
Yeah, that was a good question. There was another question about how they were exposed to it. In other words, what are the user interfaces? I don't see that question over here anymore. It seems to have disappeared. But it was good in that it's not always easy to put something there that the client is going to use. I found the most effective way to do this is to have structured sessions where you sit down with the clients and actually ask them questions rather than trying to build some user interface where they can do it themselves.
What was it that persuaded CARD to use SD?
Well,
as opposed to other approaches?
The conventional approaches weren't working. We tried them all. So I had run across SD from a professor at Wharton and said, this really looks like a good idea, and that's when we brought PA's predecessor in and took it from there.
Were the clients involved at any stage in building the model? If so, how often? So in the early days of the work, we sat in the conference room and we built the model in front of the client, piece by piece, some of the early pieces. So there was a little bit of model building. Of course, behind the scenes, the consultant has to build it before you show it you're building it with the client. But there's a little bit of that, and then we mostly started providing advice and looking at leverage tests. And then there was an internal group that, it's a few people that were trained in using the model. The next question is, who now owns and manages the model? So the model has been, at this point, pretty much been put on a shelf, and I'm not sure whether we or the client owns our model. If we've signed a contract with David Starr, the client more than likely owns the model.
Yeah, I always ask for exclusivity on these, which is why we're not mentioning the client's name. But it's definitely a secret weapon. A lot of companies try and treat it that way. I was doing this for a gaming company, or a lottery company actually, in another country. And one of the things they wanted to make sure that nobody knew that they were using it, because it really was a competitive advantage.
Right, and that company plans to sell it to market. Mm-hmm. So they're going to the market with that simulation model. So we'll probably need more of that, interactive gaming technology wrapped around it. So,
was direct input from customers used? In this case, if you only used transactional data, do you think firsthand information from customers could have changed the output?
Yeah, the way these credit card organizations are put together is they're franchises, so they have committees and groups that regulate every aspect of them, and we made a lot of use of those committees and groups.
Great, thank you. Oh, you want to ask?
Oh, and I was just going to say, we used a lot of customer surveys when we built the model.
Thank you for joining us today on this third in our series of webinars on big data, system dynamics, and XMILE. Please join us again at noon on December 17th, where Bob Eberlein will tell us about how big data is used in retail and how system dynamics can expand the boundaries of what can be determined and discovered in retail. Thank you very much.